everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Friday, June 7th, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about Greg Sankey and how he might just be the future of college football as a leader, big-time guy in the future of college football. Then we'll get into some news around analysts, how analysts might be off the field going forward. Definitely some different ways that teams are trying to cut costs, I suppose is the best way to put it. And then we'll get into some betting lines for the national championship winner and how some people are tying their wagon to a horse that I wouldn't necessarily do if I was them. But then we'll get into the playoff schedule, the TV and times for all of the games that are coming up this year before we finish it off with a recruiting update. Tons of stuff has happened throughout the week that I want to get you all updated on. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here, is to use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, gsmcpodcast.net. It's a huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of have a fun, interactive experience here, and I think that's fun for all of us. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about Greg Sankey, because he's one of the most important people in college football, and especially now when there is a huge, huge void in terms of leadership in college football, he's more important than probably anyone else. I think there's a lot of people in this sport that look at him as kind of the person to usher us into this kind of new future that we have, and some of that is a good thing, some of that is not so good a thing. I think him and Tony Petitti are kind of sitting in a kind of world of their own, sort of, in the college football world when we talk about the power to kind of make their own decisions, do the things that they want to do, and possibly even break off and do their entirely own thing. And I think a lot of this stuff started with the NCAA just not necessarily being where they should be. And we've talked about this a lot, being late to the NIL party, being late to the transfer portal, being late to a lot of the things that they needed to be early on, or this stuff was going to start to happen. And it feels like it's not only the fans that feel this way, it is Greg Sankey as well. There were a couple of meetings throughout the last couple of years where they were trying to figure all this out. They were trying to figure out, what the next step is for revenue sharing and for transfer portal and NIL and everything in between. And a lot of those meetings, as you can probably imagine with the NCAA, didn't necessarily get a lot done. There were a lot of people in that room just kind of going back and forth, not necessarily getting to conclusions that they needed to get to. And it felt like at some point Greg Sankey got a little bit upset, and he's been a little bit more outspoken throughout this time, and especially during the SEC spring meetings. He was very, very outspoken about some of the issues that he has, and quote-unquote, as he said it, sometimes you have to be a jerk, and you just have to, move forward and make the decision to get that 1% step forward instead of standing still and just worrying about the, consequences or the things that possibly could happen. You got to take that step forward and then deal with the landscape as it comes. So it's one of those things that is going to be really, really fascinating to watch. I mean, the SEC and the Big Ten are in a situation where they hold essentially all the cards, with all of the different things that are happening in the sport, with the new things that are going to be on the checkbooks for a lot of these different athletic departments, with transfer portal, with NIL, with everything in between. There's definitely a lot more pushing in their direction, right? And especially in Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti's direction. And the good news for Greg Sankey is he has just a little bit more experience in this world than Tony Petitti does in terms of being a conference commissioner. He was the conference commissioner in the Southland Conference from 1996 to 2002. If you don't know what the Southland Conference is, look it up, because it's one of the most beautiful conferences ever. Every school is within like 100 miles of each other, so it's definitely a little bit of a blast from the past there. But it's one of those things where he's seen every side of the sport. There's been, times when he's been, obviously, the commissioner of the Southland Conference has to deal with very, very different things than the SEC. So it's going to be really interesting to see what he kind of goes forward as. Does he totally hitch his wagon to the SEC, and are they moving forward as their own entity? Maybe him and the Big Ten move on and start their own little world off in kind of the distance because they have the ability to do that. Maybe he pushes for college football and college basketball to break off. He has a ton of different ideas, and I can't necessarily say that I agree with all of them, but what I can say is this guy is very smart, and he knows exactly what this sport is up against, and he knows that there are a lot of people up top that aren't super concerned with actually fixing the problem. They're more concerned with looking at it, saying it's a problem, and hoping that everyone will come to them for them to fix it. So I think it's one of those things where you look at Greg Sankey, you look at Tony Petitti, even Brett Yormark is someone that I think is going to have a ton of power when we go into the future of the sport, and you wonder what their future is in terms of their position. Is Greg Sankey going to be the SEC Commissioner for the next decade? Or is he someone that maybe breaks off and becomes the College Football Commissioner, as a lot of people have dubbed it? And I think that's something that has gotten a lot of backing from a ton of college football fans, some coaches, some different people that know him, because they understand what he's about, and they understand that he fully gets this sport and fully understands college sports in a multitude of different ways. So I think when you look at Greg Sankey, he's one of those guys that's a little bit of an enigma in the sense of he has all this power, he has all this ability, but he kind of moves in silence, which is probably the right way to go about it, if we're being totally honest. He's outspoken when he needs to. There's no two ways about that, but there's definitely been times in his career where he's just kind of been the person that is leading the biggest conference in the world, but isn't necessarily the most outspoken person in the world. But the last couple of years have really brought out that side of him, and I think it's brought out that side of a lot of people around college football, and I totally understand that. So I think he's one of those people, when you look at his, past with being at the Southland Conference and going to the SEC and making his way up from even being just I believe he was just some type of athletic assistant at one of these schools, and worked his way pretty much all the way up through all the ranks. So he understands what every athletic department is going through, because he's been in a lot of these positions, and he's had to deal with some of the problems. Now, the problems have changed very drastically in the last couple of years, and he understands that as well. But I think it's one of those things where when we go into the new future of college football, when we figure out, where all this money from the House versus NCAA case is going, and once we figure out what conference realignment is going to look like in 5 years from now or whatever, we need someone at the front that everyone can look at and say, I know that guy knows what he's doing. I know that guy understands the sport. He understands the rigors of everything that is going on around it. And not only that, they trust him and they actually kind of believe in him. And that's something that I think we can say pretty confidently about Greg Sankey. He's not necessarily the perfect person. He's not necessarily, curated to be, the perfect NCAA commissioner, but I'm not sure anyone is. I'm not sure anyone is capable of doing this job absolutely perfectly, but I do know that currently the NCAA and the way that things are working is not the way to go about it. So I think he's one of those guys that is going to be looked towards a lot, whether that's, him as the SEC commissioner, or that's him as the college football commissioner, or something totally different and a totally new title with a new governing body. I don't really know what that looks like, but the reality is we need someone at the forefront of the sport. We need a voice that is consistent, that is, loud, that everyone understands, that everyone listens to, and you'd be hard-pressed to find someone that fits that criteria better than Greg Sankey. And I think he's one of those people that I don't necessarily agree with everything that he has to say. He does lean a little bit into the SEC and the Big Ten being the power brokers and maybe leaving some of the smaller conferences behind. I know he has a idea, or he is one of the backers of expanding the basketball tournament for the NCAA, which I don't like one bit, but that's totally beside the point. But he's one of those people that fully understands college sports, and he's been in a lot of different positions. He's dealt with a lot of different people. He has tons of different connections, and I think that's kind of the crux of this argument, where you have a guy who has been the leader of probably the most influential, one of the biggest conferences in college football over the last decade. And when you talk about that, that means he has access to guys like Nick Saban, like Kirby Smart, like some of the former athletes that have come through, because they know him. They've met him. They've kind of interacted with him, and definitely are doing an incredible job and believe in him because he's done such an incredible job at the SEC. So I think it's one of those positions where college football for so long has been a lot of people that don't fully understand the sport or don't fully love the sport the same way that you and I do, making decisions about the sport. And that's never the way that we wanted things to go about. And I think Greg Sankey, at the very least, would be a very big step in the right direction in terms of that. So I think he's someone that not only, we can feel confident, cares about the sport, understands the sport, but also has connections in the sport that can help him down the road, where there's going to be decisions that he doesn't fully understand because he hasn't been a head coach or he hasn't been a player in this new reality. So he's going to have to lean out and, get a little bit of help from maybe Nick Saban or from some of the former coaches or some of the former players that he has dealt with in the past. And I think when doing that, if the NCAA were to call some of these people, I don't necessarily think they get the access that Greg Sankey would. So a lot of the future of college football is really just about putting someone at the forefront that everyone can point to and say, I trust that guy, or say, I believe in that guy, or whatever that looks like. You have to have someone that everyone is willing to rally behind, and everyone's willing to help out, find out all these answers. And it feels like a lot of people, including Greg Sankey, are distancing themselves from the NCAA instead of going towards that and trying to figure out the problem. And I think it's not necessarily because they don't care about fixing the problem. I think it's more they don't trust the NCAA to take their actual worries into account. And I'd love to tell you that they're wrong to think that, but I can't necessarily say that. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch this kind of new era unfold. Is Greg Sankey just going to break off the SEC and maybe join and bring Tony Petitti and the Big Ten with them and be their own entity? Is the college football going to break off and he be the college football commissioner? Is he going to stay with the SEC and just, dominate over there? Who knows what the future holds? But what I can say with absolute confidence is this is one of the most powerful guys in the sport, and he will be for quite some time to come. And I think his power is only getting bigger, if I'm being totally honest. So he's going to be really, really fascinating to watch. I think when you look at college football and you look at who is defining the sport the most, it's really hard to overlook Greg Sankey. And I think he might just be at the very top of that list, and we might just need him to be right about now. But we'll take our first break here, and when we come back, we're going to talk about Analysts. It sounds like with the House settlement and all of the new money that is going to have to be paid by some athletic departments, they're trying to cut costs, and some of those costs might be the analysts that have been on the field for a number of big programs throughout history. So I'll break that down and how it's going to affect some of these schools right after this, so stick with us.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the news it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We jump into the analyst talk, and there's definitely a lot going on in college football right now. I think we all understand that. There's definitely some craziness going on and definitely a lot of things changing, and with that, there's a lot of new things to pay for. That's just kind of the nature of the sport right now. That's definitely something that will be very interesting to watch as we go forward, but one of the ways that it has been pointed to as a way to kind of subside some of the worries in terms of the financials coming up is possibly getting rid of analysts going forward in college football. And if you remember when we were talking about, or not when we were talking about, but if you remember that man right there, Nick Saban, he was the one that kind of made this a huge thing. You bring in former head coaches, former coordinators, just big time people that fully understand what they're doing in the sport. You bring them on on your staff for a absolute bargain, and you make them really, really good resources for you. So I think it's an incredible thing that absolutely has made Bama hugely successful. I think that's a huge piece of what Bama has done over the last decade, and I think Nick Saban would tell you that first and foremost. So he's had guys like Mike Locksley, who was a head coach at New Mexico before he came over. You had obviously Steve Sarkisian, Lane Kiffin. So has added a ton of really, really incredible guys throughout his career. I mean, Mike Locksley and Steve Sarkisian, while they were there, were making $80,000 combined as analysts at Alabama, and I think with two Power 4 coaches at this point, that's an absolute bargain. So absolutely remarkable that he was able to get those guys on that roster. You also had Billy Napier found his way into that kind of group when Nick Saban brought him over as an analyst, and he brought that over to Florida. Now, didn't necessarily work as smoothly as it has in Bama for Billy Napier at Florida, because he brought in a ton of people. About $5 million were put towards the off-field analyst staff and other personnel like that. He also brought in what's called a game changer coordinator. I don't really fully understand what that means, but the reality is it's not necessarily always the best way to go about business, but it did play a huge part in what Bama was able to do. I mean, Mike Locksley and Steve Sarkisian were a huge help to Lane Kiffin as an offensive coordinator there for a couple of years before they both, Mike Locksley took over as offensive coordinator, and then Steve Sarkisian followed him right up, coming back from the Falcons after a little bit of time in the NFL. So I think a lot of this stuff is going to be really interesting to watch. And when you look at a lot of the different things that are going to happen around the sport with cutting costs, whether it's, in terms of analysts or in terms of scholarships, whatever that looks like, you got to be a little bit happy that this leans more towards the coaches than the players in terms of taking, certain resources away from teams, and you don't necessarily want that for certain coaches, but also these coaches will definitely find jobs just at, lower levels. So it'll kind of be an interesting thing to watch where you're trying to cut costs and you're trying to put yourself back in the black and not have to worry about a lot of the different things happening around, revenue sharing and everything in between that you have to pay for going forward. But the reality also is, some of these schools have the ability to deal with that while still having some of these analysts on staff. So it'll be really, really fascinating. I mean, there used to be a cap on the 10 on-field assistants that are allowed to coach players during games, and that has been eliminated. It was eliminated last month by the FBS Oversight Committee, so definitely a huge kind of twist in this whole thing. And although I think most of those numbers will likely be around that 10 or even below that number, I do think there's some teams that are more equipped to kind of keep the status quo, as it were, in their program and keep it moving. So maybe it's the Texas, maybe it's Alabama still, although it seems like Kalen DeBoer is kind of moving away from that slowly. But maybe there's some teams out there that want to keep their analysts on staff and are willing to spend a little bit more money to do that. And I don't know necessarily how much of a competitive imbalance it would cause. I know for Nick Saban it has for quite some time, but I do know that there are certain schools that don't necessarily have to worry about this as much as others. Now, pretty much everyone has to worry at least a little bit about this. I'd be lying to you if I said, Alabama or Texas don't have to think about this, because they absolutely do. There's going to be some really, really hard decisions that are going to have to be made, maybe cutting off some of these analysts, maybe cutting off some money going to smaller sports and things of that nature. So there's going to be hard decisions that absolutely have to be made. This one feels like one of the easier ones to make, if we're being totally honest. If we're trying to get over hurdles and we're figuring out which one's the easiest one to get over, this is probably it. So it's not necessarily the biggest hit in the world, but it is one of those things that might not really show itself. You might not necessarily notice it outright from the get-go, but you absolutely will change the way that college football teams work. It will absolutely change, the ability in a certain room, because Alabama had, I think, 8 different current Power 5 head coaches on their staff at one point, and a couple of them were analysts. I mean, Dan Lanning was an analyst over there. So it's remarkable what they were capable of getting from some of these people, from some of these positions in the past, and some people aren't going to be willing to give that up. And it'll be interesting to see kind of how different people go about it. Do certain schools keep 10 staff members on salary no matter what? Do they keep all these coaches and, deal with everything else, by taking money away from smaller sports or doing things of that nature? Or do they cut this? Do they cut some roster spots for football and try to kind of spread it a little bit more evenly? I think a lot of us would prefer the latter to the former, but I think there are going to be a lot of decisions that have to be made by some athletic departments that might not be the most popular in the world. So it's one of those things that when you look at the past in college football, it's been a lot about, who has the best staff, who has the most guys in the room that know the most stuff. And Bama was winning that race by an absolute mile for the last about decade because they had so many former head coaches, so many former coordinators on staff for, $35,000, $40,000, not necessarily breaking the bank by any means, but all of those things do add up. We talked about Florida. They're spending $5 million on that. That's going to have to go down. I can almost promise you that. So I don't know when that happens. I don't know who the people are. I think the game changer coordinator over at Florida might just be biting his nails right about now, but you never really know what's going to happen in the future, and I think a lot of these different schools will have ability to make different decisions than some smaller schools or some smaller sports in some different areas. So I think it's going to be fascinating to watch. I think it's one of those things where when you professionalize this sport, when, NIL and all of this stuff came into play, this was kind of going to happen. There was going to be places where you're going to have to cut some costs, and that's just kind of the way of things. I mean, in the NFL, where it is a fully professionalized sport, there's only 53 roster spots, and they're trying to take it down from 130 to 100 in college football. So you're going to have to start cutting costs some different ways, and it's going to have to get a little bit ruthless at times. So frankly, if analysts are the thing that we're losing and that's the only thing we're losing, I am okay with that. I can live with that. But, it's definitely going to go further, and it's definitely going to have a lot more reaching implications than we probably think right now. But this is definitely a big shakeup to the way that college teams are going to work. 2024 might be the last time that you see 4 or 5 former head coaches on a sideline for a team. Will Muschamp is still over there at UGA. I think he'll probably stick around because he is so important to that staff. But some guys will be, let go. Some guys will fall off, and maybe they'll find jobs at a lower level and start helping some smaller teams make their way up, which I think would be great. But it is definitely going to be a little bit of a wrench thrown into the works of some of the big-time teams out there that have leaned on these guys really, really aggressively. And some of these guys are hugely important to what their teams do. Mike Locksley and Steve Sarkisian, I think Nick Saban would tell you and Lane Kiffin would tell you they were hugely important to their success during those years because they were really good at developing third down, red zone type plays that got them in the end zone. And I think there were a lot of big-time plays during those seasons that you could probably thank Steve Sarkisian and Mike Locksley for, and it's because they're two of the best offensive minds in the game. So this is going to be a really, really interesting thing. It puts even more earnest on the coaches that are there right now and are safe in their positions, but it's going to be fascinating to watch how other teams implement this, how they go about it, and if they, shy away from this and they keep all their analysts and they want to, push a lot of money towards football, or they try to scale it back slowly and do that and kind of push money towards some other sports. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I definitely think it's one of those things that we'll see impacts of, but I think we won't necessarily know that they're big impacts until much later down the road. So it'll be fascinating to watch who is, staying on staff, who's not staying on staff, and how it kind of develops in these different athletic departments, these different coaching staffs across the country. But let's take our second break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the national title and how people have started to really bet on it. And there's definitely some very interesting trends that I want to break down for you, including one team that is getting a lot of bets when they probably shouldn't. But I'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it?
GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube to catch one of your new favorite shows, like the GSMC College Football Podcast, Chip Shot Football Podcast, Hoops and Heels Women's Sports Podcast, GSMC Basketball Podcast, and so many more. Check it out for yourself. GSMC Sports Network, now available on YouTube absolutely free. Search GSMC Sports Network on YouTube right now.
Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about analysts possibly being gone in college football and some of the different things that are going on to make the pocketbooks work for some athletic departments out there, because there are going to be some things they have to pay for that they might not be prepared to pay for right about now. But let's get into some national championship betting trends, and there's a lot of stuff happening. There were definitely some movement in odds. There's some big movement in odds, frankly, with some different teams, and I want to break down. Let's start with the big-time players out there, the guys that are kind of leading the pack here, and it's Georgia, Ohio State, and Texas. Those are the people that have the best odds to win the national title. They have the most amount of bets. They have the most amount of money on them to win the national title. So Georgia leads the way in terms of favorites to win it at plus 325, and Ohio State is right behind them at plus 375. So as you can see, these two are kind of on their own turf right now. They are kind of playing their own game. And there's a lot of people that are noticing that, and they're paying a lot of money to bet on them. And the interesting thing here is Georgia, while they are the favorite, they are not the number one total amount of bets or the number one total amount of money spent. Ohio State absolutely dominates both those categories, and I think it's kind of for good reason. There's been a lot of hype around Ohio State this offseason, and I think when you look at what they've done this offseason, it's kind of hard to argue with. They are a national championship team. They are one that can absolutely get there, and then it's kind of a toss-up. I think when you look at Georgia and Ohio State, to me, they're 1-2, and there's a little bit of a gap. And then you have Texas and Oregon, and then there's a little bit of a gap, and then you have probably about 15 to 20 teams that are roughly around the same level and definitely could be fighting for this thing. But Ohio State and Georgia is where it starts, and Ohio State is obviously going to get a lot of love in this kind of new world, and it's definitely going to get a lot of love because of what they did in the transfer portal and what they've done in NIL the last 6 months to a year, and a lot of the different things happening in Columbus have a lot of people excited, obviously. So it's obviously a huge portion to have 35.2% of the entire money bet on national championships or national champions to go to Ohio State, but if you look at the offseason that they've had, it's kind of hard to argue with. Georgia takes it over 50%, so that's just a lot of the money. The majority of the money is going towards those two teams. But that doesn't mean it's not being spread out a little bit. Texas getting 8% of the money bet, 8% of the total bets as well, is definitely, indicative of where they're at. There are a lot of people that are starting to buy into what Texas is selling, but I promise you, if they do something special this year, in 2025, that number will be absolutely through the roof. It'll be right where Ohio State is, I would bet you. So it'll be incredible to watch this unfold. But let's look at the rest of the teams on here and see if you can pick out the team that I don't necessarily think belongs. But let's start with Oregon. They are the team that is absolutely kind of right after that. As we talked about, it's Texas, Oregon are the teams that I'm watching very, very closely, and they have about 4% of the bets right now. So definitely very interesting. They're at about 1,000 odds, definitely not too long by any means. Their odds have actually grown a little bit since they opened at 900, so some people aren't necessarily as confident in Oregon as some people might think out there. Alabama's odds have jumped a ton. They were at plus 600 to start this. Now they're at plus 1,400. So a lot of people are doubting Bama going into this year. Let's put it that way. But there are some other teams that jumped a little bit. LSU jumped a little bit up. Mississippi the exact same. So I think people are just leaning into Georgia is the team in the SEC. Let's not overthink this. Let's just go with the team that we understand and that we know and move forward from there. So maybe that's where some of this is coming into play. Michigan's right there. They're definitely a team that has dropped a ton. They were plus 800 to start this. They're plus 2,000 now. So I don't know if it's some people just, preying on their downfall. I don't know if it's some people seeing all of the changes that are going on and aren't quite as confident. But I'll just say, I wouldn't necessarily write off Michigan. I understand that, they're losing a lot of people, and there's a lot of questions going into this season with Alex Orji and how he's going to take over that quarterback position and everything in between. But the team is really solid. The defensive line is going to be absolutely dominant. The defense in general is going to be one of the top in the country, and that run game is going to be mean. There's no two ways about that. Sharon Moore knows how to open some people up and definitely give them a chance to succeed. And with someone like Alex Orji at quarterback, it makes it so much easier. You have so many openings for that guy to make big-time plays for you with his legs that it's going to be really hard for teams to defend this entirely. So while I'm not necessarily betting on Michigan to win the national title, I'm a little bit surprised it's jumped that much. But some teams that have actually got their odds to move in the right direction, we have UGA, obviously, Ohio State have gotten a ton of bets, so they're going to move up. Texas has moved up a little bit as well. Notre Dame, Tennessee, and Missouri have also moved up in terms of odds. So a lot of hype behind those teams. Obviously, Nico Iamaleava over at Tennessee is one of the most hyped up players going into this season, and I absolutely love him. I think he's one of the most remarkable players. I think his arm talent is right in between what Joe Milton had and what Hendon Hooker had, and I think Tennessee fans are absolutely going to love this kid. So maybe it does feel like 1998 this time around, and they have a chance to win a national title. Missouri making a ton of strides now, don't have nearly as many bets as everyone else does with 1.6 compared to Tennessee with 4% of the bets. But the reality is not too many people are going to put money on Missouri. That's just kind of the way of things. Now, if they follow up last season with another really good season, then you'll see that number start to climb pretty significantly going forward. But as of right now, it feels like Missouri has a ton of hurdles ahead of them in the SEC to even get to the playoff, and then there's a lot of stuff that has to go right. So I don't necessarily hate that one, but there are a couple in here that I think are going to be a little bit interesting to watch. Florida State still sitting pretty high on this list, the number one team in the ACC. I think that makes sense, frankly. When you look at last year and you say, Mike Norvell is fully ready to get this team not only in the national conversation for 1 year, but for many years to come. I think you can feel pretty confident that Florida State is at least going to be in that conversation. I've said a couple of times on here, I'm not quite as confident as some other people are in Florida State or in Clemson, who's absolutely on this list as well. But I understand where people are coming from, and I understand they're going to get a ton of bets because Mike Norvell has proven that even with a lot of transfers coming in, even with a lot of craziness around the program, he can get a winning product. There's no two ways about that. So it'll be really fascinating to watch that unfold. The team that I really want to get into, and the team that absolutely, it's crazy that they're even among these other teams, is Colorado. They are 12,000 plus 12,500 to win a national title. They also have about 4% of the bets. That doesn't make sense. Let's just be totally honest with each other. Whoever bet that money, the 4.5% of people that decided it was a good idea to bet Colorado to win a national title, light the money on fire. No disrespect to Colorado. I think they're doing an incredible job. I think Dion is absolutely building something out there that can be a really good product in a couple of years. As I look at their roster right now, they have about 20 to 22 really good players. And then the depth and everything that you need to win a national title isn't there. So while I think they upgraded on the offensive line, while I think Shedeur Sanders is going to have a better season than he had a year ago, while I think the wide receiver group is a good group, and they have the ability to make some noise in the Big 12, this is not a national championship team. If they are, then I will hang them up. I'll be totally honest with you. It will be the greatest coaching job that we have ever seen. It would be Deion Sanders being a Hall of Famer right off there. You could put him in just based off that if he was able to pull off a national title this upcoming season. So whoever made that bet, more power to you. I respect the confidence, but it's a really bad bet. Let's just put it that way. I don't necessarily think this team is going to win the Big 12, although that definitely has somewhat of a shot as opposed to this, which has very little shot. But I think Colorado is going to be a fun team to watch, and I think they're going to be much better than they were a year ago. But them being much better than they were a year ago and being a national title contender are two wildly different things. And I think as of right now, when I look at their schedule and I look at their team, they're a 7 and maybe 8 win team. And that's a good thing. They were 4-8 last year. They were 1-11 the year before. So the rebuild will still be going great, but the way that Colorado has set up this season is essentially just setting themselves up for failure, because if you don't win the Big 12, people are going to say, well, you promised a Big 12 championship. If you don't go to the playoff, people are going to say you promised a playoff berth. All of these things can't be promised when you're coming off a 4-8 season. So I fully understand the confidence around them. I fully understand Deion has that swagger about him that people are really gravitated towards, and frankly, I gravitate towards it as well. But the reality is this team is just not able to compete with the Oregons or the Alabamas. I mean, we saw they couldn't compete with the Oregons of the world last year. So it's no disrespect to what Deion is doing. He's doing just incredible, incredible things in Boulder right now. But he has so many steps to go to get to a national title contender and to especially win that national title. So while I really respect the confidence of some of these people, and I really respect that they're, putting their money where their mouth is in a lot of ways, I just think it's a terrible bet. But that's beside the point. One of the teams that I am watching very, very closely in this is Alabama. I'll be totally honest. I understand there was a lot of people that want Alabama to not succeed, that want them to fail and fall on their face and the era of Alabama dominance to be over. This is still a really good team. And if Jalen Milroe takes that step forward that you need him to, it gets a little bit interesting down there in Tuscaloosa, and I think Jalen Milroe is one of those guys that I think a lot of people around the country are just assuming he's not going to be that fantastic of a passer this upcoming year, but strides can be taken, and especially when Kalen DeBoer is the one coaching you, they can really be taken. And then Notre Dame is another team that I'm watching because I think they've done a lot of really, really good stuff this offseason, particularly bringing in Chris Mitchell at wide receiver. I think is absolutely huge. This defense is going to be absolutely dominant, led by Xavier Watts and Riley Mills and Howard Cross and all of the incredible players that they have. So those are the two teams I'm watching if you want to get a little bit crazy with it, but don't get Colorado crazy with it. No disrespect to the Buffaloes, but if they win the national title, then I'll come on here and do a full hour apology to Colorado football and to Deion, and I'll try to make it right, but I just don't see that happening. Let's just put it that way. But we'll take our third break here, and when we come back, we're going to break down the playoff schedule. It officially came out with all of the TV slots, where they're going to be played, on what channel, and everything in between. So we're going to break down all of that and kind of what we can look forward to for these games right after this. So stick with us.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere podcasts are found.
Alrighty, welcome back, everyone. We just talked about some of the betting odds going out around the national title and some of the trends that are forming around those odds, and there are some very interesting ones. Let's just put it that way. But there is going to be some very, very interesting things going on with the playoff this upcoming year. A 12-team playoff is officially here. We are going to get into that in 2024, and we finally have the TV schedule for these things. There were a lot of different speculation about when this stuff was going to be happening, and we officially have confirmation of when it all is going to go down, and it's going to be a full month of college football, which is just absolutely incredible. But let's start to break this down and give you guys an idea of where we all stand. So the first round games, as we kind of knew already, there's going to be one on that Friday and then 3 on the Saturday. The 3 on the 2 of the 3 on the Saturday are going to run into a little bit of trouble with the NFL, as there's 2 games on those days. The Chiefs play the Texans at 1 p.m. on that Saturday, and the Ravens play the Steelers at 4:30. So definitely going to be a little bit of a fight with the NFL on those, but I know where I'm going to be tuned into, let's just put it that way. I think there's going to be a lot of hype around these games. There's so much excitement around the 12-team playoff and what it's going to be and how, everything's going to kind of play out. But for me, it all really boils down to those first round games are just going to be off the walls incredible. Whether it's, the Friday night or the Saturday afternoon or the Saturday night, it doesn't necessarily matter. I think all of these places are going to be on fire. When you get a home environment for a game like this, I think it's going to be one of the best environments they've seen at pretty much every stadium that gets to host these this upcoming year, whether it's in Austin, Texas at DKR or up in Happy Valley or in Ann Arbor and the Big House, whatever that looks like. These crowds are going to be off the charts. Now, it is going to come a little bit after school ends for some of these different schools out there, but the kids won't care. I can promise you that. There will be plenty of people in those cities, especially some of the big-time cities where some of the teams have national title hopes. When you talk about the Big Ten and the SEC, there's going to be two of these teams in these games that maybe don't necessarily belong there. If they're probably a top 4 team in the country, but you don't get that automatic bye if you aren't probably the Big 12 or the ACC champion. So a team like Texas, who is the second in odds to win the SEC right now, or a team like Oregon, who's second in odds to win the Big Ten right now, they're going to be sitting at 5 and 6, and that means you're going to get a game in Eugene and get a game in Austin, and it's going to be absolutely bonkers in both those environments. I can promise you that. I think if those are the two teams that come out, they're going to be on the two best slots, which honestly, frankly, right now are probably the Friday and the Saturday night because of the conflict with the NFL during those first two slots, and also the first two slots are on TNT, which is kind of a new little wrinkle into the college football playoff world. ESPN sub-licensed some of those games to TNT, and it sounds like it's going to be the two games that ESPN might not want quite as much because they are running into the NFL as well. It'll be really fascinating to see who TNT has calling these games. I don't necessarily much care who it is calling it. I do care who is on the desk in the pregame, and it has to be Ernie Johnson. It has to be the boys. If it's not, then I have a problem. But other than that, I think this is going to be an incredible, incredible atmosphere. I think when I talk about the 12-team playoff, I've never been the biggest fan of playoff expansion. I've always said, 6 teams I think is probably the good number, but we've jumped that shark. We've gone well beyond that, and I think these first-round games are a great way to get me fully in on the party because I think they're going to be just incredible to watch, really, really fun, and be one of those things that you look back on in a couple of years and wonder why we weren't doing this earlier, frankly. And then you get into the quarterfinals, and you have some of the New Year's Six Bowls. That's when everything kind of starts. You have the Fiesta Bowl on that Friday, I don't really know what day of the week it is, frankly. Oh, it's a Tuesday. There you go. A Tuesday on New Year's Eve, so kind of the same style that we've been doing in the past couple of years, but now they're playoff games, and now they're quarterfinals, and it'll be fascinating to watch. Definitely will be big-time games those days. I don't really know if the tie-ins still play any type of factor in the way that this is set up. I don't think they do, frankly, but it'll be really interesting to see. A team could win the Fiesta Bowl, the Orange Bowl, and a national title all in the same year. So it'll be really, really fascinating to watch, and I think one of those things that is going to be fascinating to watch is what we just talked about with the first round games, where a team like Oregon or a team like Texas or Bama or Ole Miss, whoever it is that comes up a little bit short in the SEC or the Big Ten, are going to be probably in these games. Maybe they get upset in those first round games, but let's just say they find their way to the quarterfinals. They might just be favored in some of those games because the 5 will match up with the 4, which will likely be the ACC or the Big 12 champion, and then the 6 will match up with the 3, which will likely be the other ACC or Big 12 champion. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think it's almost a foregone conclusion, at least in my mind, that unless, Florida State or Clemson go absolutely crazy and totally dominate the ACC, I think Texas or Oregon would be favored, and it would be very, very interesting to watch. It would be one of those things where we'd have to probably get used to that because that's just kind of the way of the world. When you have those auto bids up top and you say certain teams are going to get buys, you're going to have matchups later on where the lower seeded team is probably the better team. And that's just kind of the way of things. And those quarterfinal games will be fascinating to watch for that reason, because there's going to be so much going into that. It's something we talked about earlier in the week when we talked about the motivation that goes in for the ACC and the Big 12 to knock off the big dogs, to knock off the SEC and the Big 10. And this is would be where that happens. So it'll be fascinating to watch what the lines are on those games and kind of how the ACC and the Big 12 respond to those games. And then you get into the war of attrition. You get into the semifinal and the national title game, which is essentially just have depth, have as many guys to throw at the opposing team as possible, and you'll likely come out on top. There's going to be a ton of really, really interesting things that happen throughout this. When I look across the college football landscape, there are really a handful of teams, in my mind, that have the ability to get through 17 games and still be playing really, really high-level football. And it's not necessarily a ton of teams. You know, UGA, Ohio State, we talked about. Texas, Oregon, I think, are absolutely in that group. Ole Miss and Bama are kind of hanging around that group, but definitely have some holes that you'd like to be a little bit more sturdy. And then you have Michigan and Penn State, two other teams that absolutely have some depth, but definitely some worry spots as well. So it's going to be fascinating to watch, which team actually comes out on top. And not only that, who is the players that are making those plays? Is it a guy that started on the bench to start the season? Is it a guy that, was a third stringer, or someone that, didn't even expect to be playing in these games, finding their way into a big time moment? So I think the very, very interesting thing about this playoff and about the future of the sport is depth is more important today than it ever has been before. And especially when you might be cutting the roster cap, it's going to become that much more important. And roster management and everything like that is going to be so hard to kind of wrap your head around. But it's the future of the sport. And if you want to get 17 games deep and win a national title, you're going to have some things that some other people don't. So it'll be fascinating to watch. I think when you look at a lot of this different stuff, the only real big issue is the one that I've had for a very long time around this. And it's the fact that we play a national title on a Monday. This is a Saturday sport. It doesn't make sense to me. I understand you're trying to, get out of the way of the NFL. Don't get out of the way of the NFL. Just play the game on the day that we're all expecting college football to be played, and don't make us do it on a Monday when I have to wake up the next day and do one of these shows or go to work or do something like that. So make it a Saturday game going forward. That's the easiest layup in the world for the NCAA or for the college football playoff to make. So that'll be fascinating to watch. But we're going to take our final break here. And when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the different things going on in the world of recruiting. Definitely a huge week for recruiting, and UGA was right at the center of it. So we'll break that down right after this. So stick with us. Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about some of the different things going on with the playoff and the TV schedule with it. It's definitely going to be a very, very interesting month of football and a lot of overlapping things, whether it's college football playoff or bowl games or NFL. There's going to be plenty of football to watch around that time of year, and Don't gotta ask me twice. But it's going to be incredible to watch. But let's get into recruiting. There's so much stuff going on around recruiting. We talked about how June is a huge month, one of the biggest months in high school recruiting, and definitely a lot of stuff has already happened in the month of June before as it started. But let's jump into this and let's get into the team that absolutely dominated this last weekend and really throughout this entire week, which is the Georgia Bulldogs. And it starts with Zayden Walker, the number one linebacker in the country. He has committed to Georgia, an absolutely huge pickup for the Bulldogs. Definitely someone that can kind of fill a big-time void that is going to be left by Smile Mondon when he leaves after this upcoming year. But this kid's going to be ready to go. He's absolutely incredible. Definitely someone that is going to be a huge help to the Bulldogs, and they just rake in linebackers year after year, whether it's Justin Williams a year ago or CJ Allen 2 years before that. It's just incredible what they've been able to do at the linebacker position, and that's not stopping anytime soon. Let's just put it that way. And then two other guys that we talked about last week were Isaiah Gibson and Justice Terry, two guys that are committed to USC. Justice Terry was committed to UGA. Well, it sounds like that guy right there, Isaiah Gibson, might be flipping to UGA. Steve Wiltfong put in a flip for him to go from USC to UGA. Would be an absolutely huge steal for UGA, and they're definitely kicking the rocks on Justice Terry as well. Definitely someone that they would like to get back on board. I've heard some murmurs about him possibly flipping back, but not really sure what's going to happen there. Definitely less than I've heard around Isaiah Gibson. But let's move on to some other teams around the country and some big-time commitments. And frankly, it all starts with Keelan Russell, an absolutely huge flip, the number 7 quarterback in the entire country, flip from SMU to Alabama, and a huge get for Kalen DeBoer and company. I think Keelan Russell is absolutely special. He's one of my favorite recruits in the entire country. I think he can do things on a football field that not a lot of people on planet Earth can do. There's so much things to like about this kid. Definitely one of those guys that can kind of usher Bama into this new era. I think, Jalen Milroe is going to do a fantastic job, but when you're only there for 1 year with a new head coach, it's hard to be the quarterback that ushers you into the new era. And I think Keelan Russell is going to walk right in and be probably competing for a starting job pretty much right away. I think he's really that incredible, and I've seen some people online trying to, clown Alabama for saying he's coming from SMU, he can't be that good. He is that good. I can promise you he's that good. So I would be a little bit worried if I were an LSU fan or if I was a Georgia fan or whatever it is. This guy's going to be a problem at the next level. I can almost promise you that. And then another big-time commitment was Bo Jackson. Yes, Bo Jackson. I actually mean that. Not the Bo Jackson, of course, but the number 4 athlete in the country. He is committed to Ohio State. Will play running back at the next level, most likely. And a huge time win for Carlos Lachlan, the new running back coach over there at Ohio State. When you're taking over for someone like Tony Alford, who found his way over to Michigan, you got to get big-time wins on the recruiting trail. And he has done that a ton at Oregon, but now at Ohio State, he's just picking up where he left off. An absolutely huge pickup for them. Definitely someone that just adds to that number 1 class that they already have. So the Buckeyes are doing what they always do in recruiting, which is just absolutely dominating. But let's get into some other intel from around the country. Andrew Babalola is definitely someone that you definitely want to know. A 5-star offensive lineman. It sounds like he might just be heading over to Stanford. An absolutely huge pickup. The Cardinal can always recruit big boys, that's for sure. They do not struggle recruiting offensive linemen, so he's definitely someone to watch. If Stanford can pick him up, he's going to be the linchpin on that left side of that offensive line, probably for the 3 or 4 years that he's there. And then we'll go back to Georgia here for a second. They are hosting a number of big-time players and are hoping to get the same thing they got from Zayden Walker this past week. DJ Pickett is a number 2 cornerback in the entire country. He will be on campus, as well as David Sanders Jr., the number 1 tackle in the country, will be on campus. And David Sanders Jr. is someone that has been trending kind of more away from Clemson and towards Georgia over the last couple of weeks. So definitely one to watch. I don't necessarily expect a commitment there this weekend, but a lot of stuff can happen. You never really know. And then Texas is someone we've talked about a little bit. They are still leading for guys like DeCorian Moore and Jamie French, but some people are really trying to push them for that. Ohio State has made a big-time step up in Decoria Moore's recruitment after a visit from him last week. LSU and Miami are definitely going after Jamie French really, really aggressively. Jamie French actually will be in College Station this weekend for Texas A&M, so definitely a huge, huge battle for Texas, and those will absolutely go down to the wire. I have no doubt that both of those commitments will probably happen somewhere in November to December. If it does happen earlier, then I would not expect them to flip, because I think they've fully made their decision. They're probably just fully done with recruiting. So it's the same thing that Zayden Walker said when he committed to Georgia, actually. So another thing with Texas, they are hosting the number one athlete in the country, Michael Terry, this upcoming weekend. They've been kind of the leader on him, but there's been a lot of it's been pretty quiet around him the last couple of months. So don't necessarily know where his recruitment stands, but it'll be a huge week for Texas around that. We talked about Texas A&M. They also have Jonah Williams coming onto campus, the number one safety in the country, Michael Fafusi, the number 3 offensive tackle in the country. So a huge weekend for the Aggies and Mike Elko. If they can somehow get Jonah Williams to commit this weekend, it would be absolutely huge for them. And then Miami is heating up on Elijah Griffin, one of the best defensive linemen in the country. He had been kind of leaning heavily towards UGA the last little bit, but Miami's really trying to pull this one off. And if they can pull it off, it'll be a huge get for Mario Cristobal and everyone around that program, because you need linchpins on that defensive line, and Elijah Griffin would be that. Absolutely. That guy right there. So an absolute beast on the defensive side of the ball. But I also wanted to get you caught up on some portal stuff that has happened over the last couple of weeks. Chris Hardy, who is one of the top defensive linemen still in the portal, has committed to Ole Miss, an absolutely huge pickup for Lane. I think he's making it nearly impossible for this defense to not be much better than they were a year ago, and to have some of the depth that I was a little bit worried about early on with Ole Miss, but they've done a great job of backfilling some of that roster and making sure that it's not just Walter Nolan and Princely Umanmielen on the defensive line. It is some other guys that can rotate in and definitely help them out. So big time pickup there. We also had Star Thomas, a really good running back out of New Mexico State. He committed to Duke. Definitely someone that will be able to kind of help that run game with Jordan Waters finding his way to NC State. You need as many bodies as you possibly can, because Jordan Waters is really incredible. So a huge pickup for them. Star Thomas is really, really incredible, and definitely someone that a lot of people around the industry were just waiting on to commit. But a huge pickup for Duke, a huge pickup for Manny Diaz there. And then we had Colin Gill, a cornerback from Oregon. He flipped his commitment from Temple to UGA, and I don't necessarily know what happened there. It's kind of a weird one. It must have been, Kirby Smart and Will Muschamp and Charvarius Robinson, some of the other guys over there, saw something in this kid that apparently not a lot of other people did. I don't necessarily expect him to start or be a big-time player this upcoming year, but obviously, this is someone they wanted on their roster. So it'll be really interesting to see this guy's kind of journey. Is he in the portal again after next year, or is he sticking around in Athens a little bit and becoming a big-time player for them? It'll be really interesting to watch that one. We also had a very interesting saga with Simeon Barrow Jr., the Michigan State transfer that committed to Miami. It sounded like he might have been thinking about re-entering the portal and possibly going to Missouri in the latter stages of this offseason, but it looks like he's going to stay put in Coral Gables. The portal is always going to be a fight. You're never really safe from a lot of these different things that can happen, so definitely a really weird situation, but not necessarily unique in a lot of ways. So very, very interesting, but huge for Miami to keep that guy on campus. Now, there's still big-time guys out there. Jacoby Matthews is still out there. Jalen Berger, Zachary Franklin. So there's guys to be had, and I don't really know what's going on with their recruitment. I'm not sure how long those will take. Maybe they'll commit right before fall camp and just join a team and hope that they can pick things up. I know Zachary Franklin and Jacoby Matthews seem to be kind of leaning towards Washington, but it's been that way for quite some time, and a commitment has not come yet. So I'm not sure what's going on there, but it'll be fascinating to watch all of the recruiting updates, whether it's the portal or high school. There's so much stuff going on. So it's going to be really, really fun to watch, and definitely this month is going to be the defining one in this recruiting cycle, if I had to say. But That'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, all of the social pages for all of the content and updates you could possibly need. We have incredible people doing really, really good work across every sport you could possibly want. So come on over to GSMC and we have you totally covered. But thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.
Let's go.